I was standing on a glacier in northern Norway when I got the text that changed everything. No warning, no apology, just three blurry photos and one sentence from my neighbor back home that said, Eli, I think somebody tore your ice barn down. At first, I honestly thought she meant storm damage, or maybe some teenagers broke windows again, because people did that sometimes during tourist season. But then she sent one more picture, and my stomach just dropped. There was nothing left. Just a flat patch of dirt and shattered limestone where my family's ice house had stood since before the Civil War. I remember sitting down right there in the snow with my gloves still on, staring at my phone while freezing wind hit my face, thinking, no, that's impossible. You can't accidentally erase 170 years of history in a weekend. My name's Eli Mercer, and up until last year, I lived a pretty quiet life on Lake Holloway in upstate New York. I owned about 20 acres of inherited waterfront land, most of it wooded, old maple trees, cattails near the shoreline, the kind of place where mornings smell like wet cedar and cold lake water. But the centerpiece of the property wasn't the cabin I lived in. It was the old stone ice house my great-great-grandfather built back in the 1850s. Before refrigeration existed, men used to cut giant slabs of ice from the frozen lake every winter, haul them into that building, pack them with sawdust, and preserve them year-round. That ice house supplied nearby towns for decades. Hospitals, butcher shops, railroad dining cars, all of it. And somehow, against all odds, the building survived. Fires, floods, storms, developers, everything. My grandfather used to tell me, that building outlasted 3 wars and 2 economic collapses. Means the Mercers are too stubborn to disappear. He loved that place. So did I. When my parents died, I moved back home permanently and spent almost 12 years restoring it. Not turning it into some fake polished museum either. I kept it authentic. Original stone insulation walls, antique pulley systems, iron tools from the railroad era, even handwritten delivery logs we found sealed in a rusted tin box under the floorboards. Local schools brought kids there every spring for tours. Historians came through all the time. The county officially designated it as a preservation landmark back in 2016. Then the Halstons moved in next door. Grant and Celeste Halston came from California money, tech money specifically, and they bought the massive lakefront estate beside mine during the pandemic when rich people started fleeing cities and pretending they suddenly loved nature. Their house looked less like a home and more like a luxury resort somebody dropped into the woods by helicopter. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls, heated stone patios, imported palm trees that absolutely should not survive in New York winters. The whole thing felt ridiculous. The first time I met Grant, I was giving a history tour to a group of middle school kids. He walked over smiling, expensive loafers sinking into the mud near the shoreline, and said, "So this is the famous little rock shed everybody talks about." I laughed politely because I figured he was joking, and I started explaining the history behind it. The old ice harvesting business, the preservation work, the landmark designation. He nodded through the whole thing with this weird half-smile, like someone pretending to care during a meeting they already checked out of mentally. Then he looked past me toward the lake and said, "Must be tough having that thing block your sunset every night." I remember blinking at him because the ice house wasn't anywhere near his property line. It sat fully inside mine, surrounded by trees. You could barely even see it from his mansion unless you walked down near the dock. Still, something about the way he said it stayed with me. Over the next few months, little things started happening. Survey flags disappeared. Someone cut through one of the old trails connecting my property to the shoreline. Tour buses started getting complaints from neighbors saying the historical tours were noisy. Then one afternoon, Celeste stopped me while I was checking mail and casually asked if I'd ever consider selling the ugly stone structure near the water. Not the property, just the structure. I told her no. She smiled without blinking and said, "Everything has a price eventually." That sentence sat in my head for weeks after I left for Norway. Looking back now, I think they'd already decided what they were going to do before my plane even took off. By the time I made it back to New York, I hadn't slept properly in almost 30 hours. I drove straight from JFK to Lake Holloway still wearing the same wrinkled jacket from Norway, surviving on gas station coffee and pure adrenaline. And the whole drive I kept telling myself maybe the pictures were misleading. Maybe only part of the structure collapsed. Maybe somebody hit the wrong angle with a bulldozer and there was still something left to save. There wasn't. The moment I pulled into the gravel driveway, I saw bare sky where the roofline used to be. That was the first thing that hit me. Empty sky. For almost my entire life, those old limestone walls had stood there against the lake like they belonged to the land itself. And now it looked like somebody had ripped a tooth out of the earth. I got out of the truck and just stood there for a second listening to the wind move through the trees. No birds. No tour signs. No creaking wood from the old pulley beams. Just silence. Then I walked closer. Pieces of the original insulation stone were scattered everywhere like broken gravestones. The old iron harvesting hooks my grandfather restored by hand were bent underneath tire tracks. One of the cedar support beams still had traces of white paint from the 1920s restoration, snapped clean in half and tossed into a burn pile like garbage. I actually picked up one of the stones and just stared at it in my hand because I couldn't process what I was seeing. You spend 12 years preserving something, protecting it, documenting every inch of it, and some rich idiot with landscaping opinions wipes it off the map in 2 days. That's when my neighbor Ruth came walking over from across the road. She looked sick to her stomach. "Eli," she said quietly, "I tried calling you." According to Ruth, demolition trucks showed up 4 days earlier. She assumed I'd hired them. Everybody did at first because the crew had permits taped to the dashboard and professional equipment. But then she overheard one of the workers joking about cleaning up the Millionaire's Lake view, and she realized something was wrong. "Grant was down here supervising the whole thing," she told me. He kept pointing toward the shoreline, saying he wanted everything opened up before summer. Everything opened up. Like my family's history was overgrown brush. I didn't even answer her. I just pulled my phone out and called Grant immediately. He picked up on the second ring, sounding weirdly relaxed, like he was expecting me. "Eli," he said, "you back already?" I remember gripping the phone so hard my hand hurt. "You tore down my ice house." A pause. Then he sighed. Actually sighed, like I was inconveniencing him. "Look, man, we thought it was abandoned." "Abandoned?" I snapped. "There are historic plaques on the dam entrance." "Well, our architect said the structure looked unstable." "It was a protected landmark, Grant." Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Honestly, the lakefront looks a lot better now. I don't think I've ever felt anger hit me that fast before. Not yelling anger. Worse, cold anger. The kind where your body suddenly goes still because your brain realizes the person on the other end genuinely doesn't care." "You destroyed private property," I said quietly. "Historic property." Grant laughed under his breath. Actually laughed. "Come on, Eli. It was basically a pile of rocks." "No," I said. "It was legally protected." And that's when his tone shifted completely. "Well then," he said, "I guess you should call a lawyer." Click. I stood there staring at my phone while the wind came off the lake so hard it rattled the trees behind me. Then I looked across the shoreline toward the Halston estate. Massive glass windows glowing gold in the evening sun, boats tied neatly at the dock, workers setting up patio furniture near the water like none of this mattered. That was the moment I decided I was done being reasonable. The next morning I drove into Albany and met with an attorney named Daniel Keene. Older guy, former land use prosecutor, looked permanently annoyed even while drinking coffee. My dad used him years ago during a property dispute, and people around the county called him the Undertaker because once he took a case personally, somebody usually got buried financially. I spread everything across his conference table: landmark registry paperwork, survey maps, historical certifications, photos from restoration projects dating back a decade. Daniel barely spoke for 20 minutes while flipping through documents. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Jesus Christ." "Yeah. No," he said, tapping the papers. "I mean legally. This is catastrophic for them." Turns out Grant hadn't just destroyed a building. He demolished a registered historical structure sitting entirely within surveyed private property boundaries, without notice, without permits connected to the actual owner, and apparently without even verifying ownership records properly. According to Daniel, the fines alone could become insane before we even touched civil damages. Then he asked me something I wasn't expecting. "What do you actually want?" At first I said I wanted reconstruction costs, which was true. But the more I talked, the more honest I became. "I want him to understand what he did," I said, "because right now he thinks this is just rich people inconvenience money." Daniel nodded slowly like he'd heard that answer before. 3 days later, Grant received a formal demand letter. $870,000 for authentic historical reconstruction, preservation penalties, loss of artifacts, and property damages. He had 10 business days to settle before litigation moved forward. Grant's response came through some giant Manhattan law firm with a logo that probably cost more than my truck. Their argument basically boiled down to this: the structure was unsafe, visually deteriorated, and mistakenly believed to be abandoned. Then they offered me $60,000 in funding for a tasteful memorial plaque commemorating local ice harvesting history. A plaque for a building his crew bulldozed into the dirt. Daniel actually laughed while reading the letter. "They think you'll fold because they're richer than you," he said. But here's where things got strange. Instead of backing off during litigation, Grant doubled down. About a month into the lawsuit, construction crews started showing up near the shoreline again. At first I thought maybe they were repairing landscaping damage from the demolition, but then one morning I walked down toward the lake and saw concrete forms being poured directly where the ice house foundation used to sit. I stared at the workers for a second before asking one of them what they were building. "Lakeside cabana," he said. "Outdoor kitchen, bar, rooftop deck. Right on top of the original foundation." I walked straight over to Grant's property after that. He was outside drinking wine with 2 guests like some kind of luxury vacation commercial. "You're building on protected historical ground," I said. Grant didn't even stand up. "My attorney says the structure's gone," he replied calmly. "Nothing historical left now." I remember laughing because I genuinely couldn't believe the arrogance anymore. You destroyed the landmark, and now your defense is, "The landmark's destroyed." One of his guests awkwardly stood up and walked inside. Grant took a sip of wine and looked at the lake. "You know what your problem is, Eli," he said. "You're emotionally attached to dead things." The judge stopped him immediately. "No," she said sharply. "I asked Mr. Halston." Grant cleared his throat and said, "We believe the prior structure no longer held historical relevance after demolition." You know those moments where an entire room collectively realizes somebody just said the dumbest thing imaginable? Yeah, even Daniel looked stunned. The judge leaned back slowly in her chair and said, "So your position is that destroying protected history removes the obligation to preserve it?" Silence. Absolute silence. Then came the ruling. Judge Holloway called the demolition reckless, unlawful, and historically destructive. She ruled that the ice house had unquestionable landmark protection, confirmed it stood entirely within my surveyed property lines, and determined that Grant knowingly ignored preservation obligations after receiving formal notice. Then she hit him with the part nobody expected: equivalent remedy authorization. Under a rarely used property restoration statute tied to unlawful demolition and assessed value recovery, the court approved immediate compensatory removal rights against non-essential waterfront structures belonging to the defendants, equal to the appraised destruction value and associated penalties. In plain English, Grant destroyed something worth nearly $900,000. Now the court was allowing me to remove something worth the same. And Grant's luxury boathouse just happened to fall directly into that valuation range. I remember Grant standing up so fast his chair almost tipped backward. "This is insane," he snapped. "You can't seriously be authorizing retaliatory destruction." Judge Holloway looked him dead in the eyes and said, "No, Mr. Halston. You authorized the destruction. The court is authorizing consequences." Man, you could have heard a pin drop after that. 2 days later, I stood near the shoreline drinking black coffee while demolition equipment rolled down the Halston driveway at sunrise. The lead contractor was a guy named Vince Maddox, built like a retired linebacker, probably operated excavators longer than Grant had been alive. He walked over holding paperwork and asked, "You Eli?" "Yeah." He glanced toward the massive cedar boathouse sitting over the lake. Multi-level deck, hydraulic boat lifts, outdoor bar, imported stone fireplaces. The thing looked like a billionaire yacht club somehow fused with a ski resort. Then Vince whistled softly and said, "Hell of a legal remedy." Daniel arrived about 20 minutes later carrying copies of the court order while county inspectors documented everything for compliance. Across the water, neighbors started gathering with binoculars and coffee mugs like they were tailgating for the apocalypse. And then the machine started. The first hydraulic claw punched through the upper deck railing. Just after 8 a.m. cedar beams cracked like gunshots across the lake. glass exploded outward into the water. One of the decorative steel support arches folded sideways with this horrible metallic scream that echoed through the shoreline. I'd love to tell you I felt conflicted watching it happen. I didn't. Not at first. Because every crashing beam reminded me of standing in the dirt where my family's history used to be. The boathouse came apart piece by piece over 3 days. Boat slips ripped free from their anchors. Stone patios collapsed into rubble. The lakeside bar Grant bragged about during summer parties disappeared beneath excavator tracks. Workers hauled out twisted dock frames while curious locals watched from kayaks offshore like spectators at some strange modern execution. Grant and Celeste finally showed up near the end of day 2. I'll never forget the look on Grant's face when he stepped out of his SUV. Pale, furious, honestly shocked. Like part of him still believed the rules couldn't possibly apply to people like him. He stormed toward me yelling before he even reached the shoreline. "You happy now?" he shouted. "You proving some point?" I set my coffee down on the hood of Daniel's truck and said, "You mean besides the legal one? You destroyed my property." I actually laughed at that. "No, Grant," I said. "You taught the court this was an acceptable way to solve problems." Celeste looked like she wanted to say something, but she just stood there staring at the wreckage with tears in her eyes. And for the first time, I actually felt something besides anger. Not guilt exactly, just exhaustion. Because the truth nobody tells you about revenge is that even when you win, something still rots inside you a little. My ice house was gone forever. My grandfather's tools were still buried under landfill dirt somewhere. None of this brought any of it back. The demolition ended on a rainy Thursday afternoon. 3 weeks later, Grant filed another lawsuit claiming emotional distress, waterfront value loss, and retaliatory destruction damages. Judge Holloway dismissed it almost immediately and ordered him to reimburse my legal fees on top of additional penalties tied to unauthorized landmark interference. After that, the Halstons quietly listed their estate for sale and left Lake Holloway before winter. As for me, I rebuilt part of the old ice house foundation into a memorial garden using surviving stone from the rubble. Nothing fancy, just benches, native flowers, and a bronze plaque with my grandfather's favorite line engraved across the bottom. Some things deserve to outlive us. Still, every once in a while, usually late at night when the lake gets quiet, I wonder whether I crossed a line somewhere. Whether preserving history should have mattered more than destroying somebody else's future, even legally. Then again, maybe people like Grant only understand loss once it finally belongs to them. So tell me honestly down in the comments. If somebody destroyed a piece of your family's history because they thought their view mattered more than your legacy, would you have done what I did, or would you have walked away?